So my question for you today is, how do you cope? How do you cope when things go wrong? How do you cope when you're under a lot of stress or a lot of pressure? I was going to say around my house. It's not really my house, but where I'm living at the minute, I can often be heard to say, tonight I'm eating my feelings. Not necessarily a recommended way of coping, but I would suspect that there are lots of us who have all sorts of things that, whether jokingly or seriously, we use to cope, right? I'm going to eat food. I'm going to watch television. I'm going to go for a run. I'm going to read a book and zone out. I'm going to hang out with my friends. I'm going to have a drink. There's all sorts of things that we do to cope in a crisis. And certainly there would be no other point in Jesus' life that is more filled with crisis than these hours before Jesus is arrested and then taken to trial and eventually crucified. And he knows it's coming. It isn't a sneak attack or a surprise. He knows every moment. And so what we get to see is actually how Jesus copes in a crisis. It's really such a powerful moment to get a window into what does it look like for a human being who never made a mistake to cope in a godly way. And so what does Jesus do? If you look at Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 39, it says that Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. We see that Jesus, Luke tells us a few helpful things. The first thing he says, and Luke says this several times throughout this journey to Jerusalem, we see that Jesus, we find him stealing away, it says, to lonely places to pray. And Luke says here, as was usual for him, he had a usual spot that everybody knew Jesus is going here to pray. That the way that Jesus coped when he was in a crisis moment was to pray. But actually it was a pattern of his life all of the time. So of course it was a natural place to be in the midst of a crisis. But you'll notice that even in verse 44, it says that when he was in anguish, when the weight of what was to come was at its most heavy, its most painful, its most difficult, he prayed even more earnestly. The way that Jesus coped was prayer. And you'll notice he says twice to the disciples, once in verse 40 and then again in verse 46, he tells them to pray so that they won't fall into temptation. Now, a little bit, there is this, perhaps this human drama unfolding of your best friends are sitting there and you're asking them to pray with you on a night when you're trying to tell them you're about to die and they can't keep their eyes open. We could fault them, but we wouldn't be much better because we wouldn't have known any more than they knew. But the reality is, I think there's something deeper here, that it isn't just that Jesus wants them to pray in this moment because he's afraid he won't go through with it. His will was set, and he was going to be obedient to the cross. It was his choice, but it was a choice he'd already made. But actually, what Jesus is trying to teach them is how to cope. Right? In the previous chapter, he talks to them about what's to come. Alex unpacked for us those 37 years of struggle and difficulty. We know that they would go on to be martyrs because they shared their faith. Jesus knew the future. He knew that it would not be easy for them, and he'd been unpacking this for them for days and weeks even. And he says to them, I don't want you to fall away in those difficult moments. I don't want you to fall into temptation. I don't want you to be tempted to leave. I don't want you to be tempted to break down. I don't want you to be tempted to give up. So pray. When things are most difficult, the way that Jesus encourages us to cope is to pray. So my question for you today is, again, we end where we began. How do you cope? What are your prayer patterns like? I'll forgive you for the emotional eating as long as you add in some prayer into those moments that we lean into and say, Jesus, what is my usual place that I'm going to be with Jesus so that I can begin to make sure that I can cope in the difficult moments, so that I can withstand the temptation to walk away when it all feels too difficult.